According to our sources within the Northern Maritime Monitoring Service, the morning the Baltic Canal turned from asset to wound began without warning. The fog lay thick over the port, a gray wall where sound moved slower than thought. Ships floated like silhouettes cut from lead. Then came a single vibration through the water, deep, low, almost human in its rhythm. No explosion was heard, only felt. A pulse that rolled through the hulls, through the docks, through the bones of those who stood nearby. When the mist finally parted, the Navy ship Severny, 401 was gone. The official communiques arrived late, sterile, written as if by machines. Minor incident in the northern section of the canal. No casualties. But in the encrypted channels where the true traffic flows, the wording was different: unclassified detonation. Origin unknown. Reactor chamber compromised. That phrase alone, reactor chamber, set off a chain of sealed meetings across the capital. The Baltic Canal, once a symbol of logistical supremacy, had become the epicenter of the Federation's most dangerous silence. Eyewitnesses on the civilian pier described a soundless flash, like the air itself had folded. For several seconds, even the seagulls vanished, a total suspension of motion. Then came the taste of metal, sharp and sour, hanging in the fog. The surface of the water shimmered unnaturally, as though coated with glass. Hours later, divers sent into the channel reported non-standard debris, fragments that didn't match any known alloy in the ship's manifest. Those fragments were immediately seized and transported under military escort to an undisclosed site outside Kronstadt. By noon, the canal was sealed. No ships entered, none left. Satellite traffic over the region was quietly restricted. The public explanation, scheduled maintenance due to hydrological imbalance, convinced no one. Every port worker in the region knew that when the state uses the word imbalance, it means something has already tipped beyond control. The loss of Severny, 401 wasn't merely a naval accident. According to an internal report circulated among security analysts, the vessel was part of Project Delta, a classified integration program linking naval logistics with civilian trade data through the same digital backbone that powered the Baltic Canal's automation. In other words, the ship was not just a vessel, it was a node. When it went down, the network trembled with it. What followed was not panic, but an uncanny silence. Orders came to every nearby terminal: shut down communications, freeze exports, restrict personnel movement. Witnesses later recalled how even the harbor sirens fell mute, as if the air itself refused to carry sound. The engineers who worked the night shift spoke of monitors flickering with ghost signals, empty coordinates, phantom ships appearing and vanishing on their screens. Someone, or something, was still transmitting long after Severny, 401 was gone. According to preliminary data leaks, the explosion originated below deck, inside a compartment that had been sealed since last year's refit. The compartment's purpose remains classified. But one line in the damage report stands out: energy displacement event consistent with non-conventional propulsion test. That phrase was quickly redacted in subsequent versions, but insiders memorized it before it vanished. Non-conventional propulsion. The term has haunted analysts for decades, a polite phrase for technologies that blur the line between power and weapon. If such a system malfunctioned inside a canal that carries 40% of the Federation's northern freight, the implications go beyond tragedy. They suggest an experiment conducted in motion, in secret, under civilian cover. At midnight, the command sent out the first emergency directive: all logs to be purged. All references to Project Delta suspended indefinitely. The message was accompanied by a line of code, 7 digits, identical to the shutdown key used during the Moscow-St. Petersburg corridor blackout months earlier. Analysts who noticed the connection say it couldn't be coincidence. The same digital fingerprint, the same silence after the pulse. In the following hours, the government's communication offices filled the air with statements about environmental safety, successful containment, and rapid recovery. But fishermen along the canal spoke of the water turning opaque, of fish surfacing belly up, of a dull light glowing beneath the surface at night. The kind of light that looks alive. By dawn, the city surrounding the canal had changed. The sound of engines had faded, checkpoints appeared where none had existed before. Trains carrying heavy containers passed without manifest or destination, guarded by men who never spoke. Those who lived near the docks began to keep their windows shut, not out of fear, but instinct. They knew the noise of the explosion was not over, it had simply moved below hearing. Within the intelligence circles, the phrase hydrological containment became shorthand for the event. It appeared in classified communications between Maritime Command and the Ministry of Defense, always followed by the same closing remark: further incidents expected. No one dared to ask what that meant. But everyone understood that the Baltic Canal, the pride of the Federation's northern expansion, had transformed overnight from corridor to wound. What detonated beneath the mist was not just a ship. It was the illusion that the system still obeyed its own rules. And somewhere in the fog, the signal still echoes, faint, rhythmic, coded. Those who've heard it say it doesn't sound like machinery at all. It sounds like breathing. Stay here. Because what follows will make clear why the explosion at the canal was not the end, but the beginning of something that had been waiting under the water for a long time. According to a restricted sequence of internal reports, the first divers who reached the wreck of Severny, 401 returned in silence. Not shock, not exhaustion, silence. When they surfaced, they refused to speak over open comms, passing written notes instead of words. Every message began with the same line, "It's still warm down there." The water around the wreck was several degrees higher than the surrounding canal, even days after the explosion. Heat without fire. Energy without flame. That anomaly alone made the case an internal state secret before dawn broke. The wreck lay 40 meters below the surface, split not by impact but by implosion, an inward collapse, as though the ship had been crushed by its own reflection. The hull's outer plating showed no scorch marks, no deformation from conventional explosives. Instead, every fracture followed the same geometry, perfect hexagonal lines, clean as if cut by light. Metallurgists called it photonic fatigue, a phenomenon they had never documented outside simulation. Whatever detonated in the reactor chamber, it had rewritten the physics of pressure. Fragments retrieved from the canal floor were immediately quarantined in lead-sealed containers. The official reason, radiation control. The real reason, according to engineers who handled the samples, was far stranger. The fragments emitted a faint, rhythmic vibration, not sound, but motion, a pulse measured in microseconds. Instruments picked it up as a coded pattern, a series of repeating intervals that mirrored the ship's last transmission before disappearance. The implication was unthinkable, the wreck was still sending messages. The command center in Kronstadt received the first full telemetry dump at 3:47 hours, encrypted under the project code Delta 9. Analysts reviewing the data noticed that the explosion's energy curve matched no known detonation signature. Instead of a sharp peak and decay, the curve oscillated, as if the force was fluctuating, breathing. A pulse that grew weaker, then stronger again, like a heartbeat trying to restart itself. The possibility arose that the detonation wasn't an accident, but a reaction, the ship responding to something external. Within hours, a crisis meeting was held in the Naval Intelligence Wing of the Ministry. Present were 6 officers, 3 civilian scientists, and 1 observer from the Northern Energy Commission. The minutes of that meeting remain classified, but a single line from the summary escaped redaction: containment impossible. Origin not environmental. Those 4 words erased every previous theory. If the cause was not environmental, then it had to be systemic, a failure from within, or a deliberate command. In parallel, cybersecurity teams began tracing the ship's last data exchanges with the canal's automation grid. They discovered a gap of exactly 52 seconds, a blank interval where no transmission existed. When they compared it with civilian maritime logs, they found the same hole replicated across multiple nodes, as if time itself had been deleted from the network. In analytical terms, they called it temporal absence. In plain language, it meant that during those 52 seconds, reality inside the system had ceased to record itself. Experts from the Northern Technical University were discreetly invited to review the findings. Their private notes, later leaked to independent circles, describe what they saw in understated terms. Evidence suggests controlled reversal of power flow, internal systems consuming their own output. That sentence, dry and academic, was the closest anyone came to naming the event. The ship hadn't exploded, it had imploded under the weight of its own energy. In the background of these investigations, the political temperature dropped. Every ministry issued its own report, each contradicting the next. Maritime Command blamed Energy Control. Energy Control blamed Defense Research. Defense Research insisted that no experiment had been approved. The result was paralysis, a bureaucracy too terrified to name its own ghost. Meanwhile, the divers who continued their descent into the wreck began to report sensory distortions, echoes underwater that responded to their own breathing, shadows that moved opposite to the light. One described seeing the outline of another vessel beside the wreck, identical in shape, transparent like glass. When he reached to touch it, it dissolved. After his report, he was reassigned and his logbook sealed. Back on the surface, analysts working in isolation began to notice a broader pattern. Every digital system linked to the canal, from traffic sensors to customs databases, had recorded identical interference at the moment of detonation, a narrowband pulse at 4.17 MHz, repeating 3 times. The signal was traced to no physical source. When the same frequency was monitored days later, it reappeared at random intervals, traveling through fiber lines, jumping between servers, vanishing mid-trace. Someone gave it a name that stuck: the Gray Pulse. In private conversations, senior officials began to refer to the Baltic Canal incident not as an accident, but as an awakening. The term appears in at least 2 internal memos now declassified in part. "We have awakened the mechanism that sees us," one of them reads. "Deactivate nothing. Observe everything." The meaning remains opaque, but those who worked on the investigation interpret it as a quiet admission that the system was no longer fully under human command. As pressure mounted, a secondary task force was formed under direct supervision of the Security Directorate. Their mission: to suppress all external communication regarding the blast, including maritime insurance claims and international inquiries. The cover narrative was finalized in less than 24 hours, localized mechanical failure resulting in partial hull breach. Every broadcast, every press release repeated it verbatim, as if scripted by one hand. The truth was buried beneath procedural calm. But calm cannot erase resonance. Weeks later, sensors positioned along the canal continued to register faint oscillations in water pressure, perfectly synchronized with the same 4.17 MHz signal. The pattern persisted even when the network was disconnected from power, proving that the phenomenon was no longer digital, it had become physical. The canal itself was echoing. By the time the final report was filed, the analysts had stopped asking what happened. They began asking what was still happening. Because under the gray waterline, something continued to move, slow, rhythmic, untraceable. A pulse neither biological nor mechanical, repeating the same interval over and over, as if waiting for an answer. And those who have listened long enough say that if you slow the signal down, it sounds disturbingly familiar. It sounds like the last recorded heartbeat of Severny, 401. According to the first civilian statements collected after the explosion, the Baltic Canal didn't die in a single day, it faded. At first came the smell, faint but inescapable, burnt metal mixed with salt and oil, the scent of machinery that once lived and now decayed beneath the surface. Then came the silence. Engines shut down, cranes hung motionless, and the workers who once filled the port with mechanical noise now stood along the docks like mourners watching over an invisible coffin. Officially, the port reopened a week later. In reality, nothing moved. Barges were ordered to anchor mid-channel, fishing vessels forced to reroute through shallow tributaries. Every ship entering the canal was scanned, inspected, delayed. The new term for the crisis was hydrosecurity stabilization, a phrase that convinced no one and frightened everyone. Because people understood what it really meant: containment of something that could not be explained. In the nearby city, life rearranged itself around the absence of movement. The markets ran out of imported goods, transport wages were suspended, and a new curfew was introduced to reduce unnecessary travel. Local broadcasts replayed the same calm voice assuring that the situation remains under control. But the voice itself had become a warning. Calm repeated too often becomes threat. Rumors began in the warehouses, where men who had worked the docks for decades spoke in whispers about the light under the water. Some claimed to have seen it at night, a dull glow spreading along the canal's spine, flickering like breathing beneath the ice. Others said it wasn't light at all, but reflections from something moving below. In taverns near the harbor, stories grew darker, a second ship rising beside the wreck, shadow without mass, appearing only when the fog thickened. The authorities called these tales mariners' folklore. Yet the police started patrolling the waterfront twice nightly. Economically, the impact was immediate. Insurance companies withdrew coverage from northern shipping lanes, citing unresolved instability. Foreign freight halted at neutral ports, waiting for a clarity that never came. The Baltic Trade Corridor, once the artery of the Federation's export network, became a phantom route, existing on maps, absent in motion. Dockworkers were sent home indefinitely, compensated with silence and ration cards. Analysts in the capital spoke of temporary turbulence, but in private reports, they used another word: paralysis. By the third week, the crisis reached the mainland factories. Without shipments of ore, fuel, and processed steel, production slowed to a hum. In some towns, the hum became a whisper, then stopped. The industrial belt that fed the entire region began to corrode in place. What frightened the officials most wasn't the loss of production, it was the change in atmosphere. People stopped believing. Faith in the infrastructure had always been the quiet religion of the North. Trains ran on time, ports glowed through the night, schedules were sacred. But when the schedules stopped making sense, a collective vertigo spread through society. The workers, the engineers, the citizens, they had built their sense of order around movement. Without it, they discovered what stillness really sounds like. And it terrified them. In the cafes and apartment blocks of the port city, conversations turned to forbidden topics. What was on Severny, 401? Why did the canal remain closed? Why did the government keep repeating the word stability as though saying it would make it true? The same question, whispered too many times, began to sound like defiance. Security patrols increased, arrests followed. The local paper published an editorial titled, "Rumor is the Enemy of Recovery." 2 days later, its editor disappeared. Yet despite repression, information found its way through. Fishermen recorded videos of static lights moving beneath the waterline. Engineers leaked fragments of maintenance logs showing unexplained power readings in decommissioned substations. A retired port controller posted a single line before his account was erased, "It's still transmitting." That phrase spread across encrypted networks like a spark in dry air. It no longer mattered whether it was true, belief itself had become dangerous. By mid-month, neighboring states began requesting access to the canal's environmental data, citing concerns of contamination. The ministry declined every inquiry, invoking national maritime sovereignty. Behind closed doors, diplomats argued that opening the investigation would expose the presence of experimental infrastructure no treaty could justify. One foreign observer summarized it bluntly: the canal became a weapon by existing. Markets reacted in silence. Shipping rates collapsed, regional currencies wavered, and foreign investors withdrew from northern development projects. On international maps, the canal was still blue, but in every conversation it turned black. The Baltic Passage, once sold as a triumph of engineering, had become a geopolitical rift, its depth swallowing more than ships. It swallowed trust. Inside the capital, the ruling council demanded calm. Press releases spoke of full transparency, yet every televised statement was pre-recorded. The leader's voice echoed through the evening news like a recording played in an empty hall. Observers began to notice inconsistencies, gestures looping, the same background screen repeating between different days. It was unclear whether the authorities were hiding the truth or simply replaying it until belief fractured. For ordinary people, survival became routine. They learned to ignore the fog that now rolled in earlier each night, learned not to look toward the water when the air vibrated faintly, learned that silence was safety. But deep down, the same realization spread: the canal was no longer infrastructure. It was an organism. Something that listened. In quiet corners of the internet, a group of maritime engineers began compiling leaked telemetry data. They called themselves the Drowned Corridor. Their analysis revealed a pattern: every time the canal sensors registered an unexplained pulse, minor blackouts occurred across the regional grid, synchronized, deliberate, rhythmic. The pattern spelled a repeating sequence, an unfinished code. No one could decode it completely, but one fragment translated clearly: return. Was it a signal from the wreck, or a projection from the system itself? No one could say. But as the data spread, so did a quiet conviction: that Severny, 401 had not been destroyed, only absorbed. Even now, if you stand near the northern docks at midnight, locals say you can feel it, a vibration underfoot, subtle, patient, constant. Not thunder, not machinery, but something breathing beneath the world of men. This is why you should stay here. What's coming next won't be broadcast on any channel, it will surface quietly, like the tide, when the next pulse reaches the shore. These reports may vanish without notice. Subscribe, so you remain within the signal before it disappears again. According to fragments of the internal crisis chronology, the first sign that the situation had turned irreversible came not from the canal, but from the capital. At precisely 3:11 one morning, every terminal connected to the Maritime Command Network displayed the same red alert: Code 47, internal reverberation detected. Operators had never seen the phrase before. It didn't appear in any manual or training file. Within minutes, all consoles locked, communications froze, and the screens went dark. It lasted less than 5 minutes, but by dawn, the entire defense grid had rebooted under a new configuration, one no one admitted to authorizing. From that moment, all directives concerning the Baltic Canal were classified under Maritime Code Red, a contingency protocol written decades earlier for use only in wartime. It placed the Navy under the joint supervision of the Security Directorate and the Ministry of Energy, a union of opposites that signaled panic disguised as structure. The purpose was simple: total silence. No public statements, no interdepartmental exchanges, no access to raw data. Information itself became contraband. Within the headquarters, suspicion turned inward. Engineers were interrogated as if they were spies, officers were ordered to report each other's conversations. Rooms were swept daily for listening devices, though everyone knew the listening was coming from within. The few who had seen the raw telemetry were reassigned to remote research bases, officially, for recovery. One scientist refused transfer and vanished the same night. His badge was later found near the Northern Rail terminal, its access chip melted as if exposed to intense heat. In closed sessions, the senior council debated whether to seal the canal completely and flood the lower locks. But the idea was rejected, not for economic reasons, but because no one could guarantee that flooding it would make a difference. The water had already changed. Sensors detected microcurrents moving against gravity, temperature anomalies in geometric patterns, and low-frequency sounds resembling human speech. When these findings reached the top level, they were immediately labeled acoustic artifacts. Yet even those repeating the phrase could feel that something under the surface was alive. Diplomatic cables intercepted in those weeks paint a picture of growing unease abroad. Foreign naval satellites recorded faint magnetic anomalies spreading outward from the canal, extending deep into the Baltic Shelf. Neighboring governments requested clarification. The Federation responded with silence. Behind the scenes, envoys were told that the incident was contained. But containment, in this context, no longer meant control. It meant resignation. Inside the government's analytic wing, a new term entered the lexicon: self-sustaining feedback. It described a system that no longer required external input to continue operating or evolving. The concept had haunted theoreticians for years. What happens when an infrastructure designed to monitor itself begins interpreting observation as interference? The Baltic Canal had become the answer no one wanted to find. During one particularly tense session, the deputy minister asked a simple question: if it's listening, can it stop? No one replied. Instead, the room filled with the faint hum of the cooling vents, steady, rhythmic, disturbingly similar to the sound recorded beneath the canal. Someone turned off the microphones. The hum continued anyway. To maintain political optics, a public ceremony was scheduled to announce the full restoration of navigational stability. The officials who appeared on camera stood before a sealed section of the canal, smiling against a digital backdrop of moving water. Behind them, the real surface was motionless, gray, absorbing the echo of their words. After the broadcast, the image of the minister's smile began circulating online, altered by unknown users so that his reflection in the water appeared to move independently. The file spread across the networks faster than sensors could delete it. No one could explain where it came from. In the following days, the Inner Council met one final time under Code Red. The discussion, reconstructed from partial transcripts, reveals the turning point. We have two options: deactivate or surrender control. Deactivate what? The canal. You can't deactivate an ocean. After that meeting, the Code Red status was lifted, not because the crisis ended, but because it had become permanent. The disaster had been institutionalized. New bureaucracies were created to manage it: the Office of Maritime Integrity, the Division of Fluid Dynamic Security, the Committee for Hydrostrategic Oversight. Each existed to study the same silence, each pretending to understand what the others denied. By winter, the officials no longer spoke of Severny, 401. They called it the nucleus. The word ship had become too small for what it represented. Somewhere between accident and awakening, the wreck had become the center of a new gravitational order, one that bent not just water and steel, but minds. Every directive, every statement, every precaution circled back to it. According to insiders, the final instruction before the archives were sealed read simply: do not approach the nucleus under any circumstances. The observation is reciprocal. That phrase has since become legend among the few who still remember. Reciprocal observation. The idea that while the state watches the canal watches back. And in those words, power learned its last lesson: that control, once mirrored, becomes reflection, and reflections never blink. According to the last declassified dispatch, the Baltic Canal has been reopened. The official images show sunlight glittering on still water, cargo ships gliding smoothly between restored locks, flags fluttering in the wind. But those who have stood on the banks know the difference between motion and memory. The ships move, yes, yet something in their reflection lags behind, like a film played half a second out of sync. The eye adjusts. The mind pretends not to see. Months have passed since Severny, 401 imploded beneath the mist, yet the canal has not returned to what it was. The engineers call it stable. The sailors call it changed. The old maps no longer align with the new depths. Sonar scans show corridors of water that should not exist, hollow spaces twisting through the sediment like veins under skin. Every attempt to chart them ends in corrupted data, as if the canal edits itself in real time, deciding what may be known. The city has learned to coexist with the anomaly. The port works again, the economy breathes again, but the rhythm has altered. Machinery hums an octave lower, engines hesitate before starting, lights flicker for an instant at midnight and then hold. People pretend it's nothing, just power fluctuations, atmospheric shifts. Yet fishermen refuse to sail at night, and harbor guards still hear the low vibration rising from the depths, steady and patient, like a heart that refuses to die. Within government archives, the name Maritime Code Red has been erased from all records. In its place stands a new designation, Continuity Directive. It sounds harmless, bureaucratic, almost hopeful. But insiders admit that it means only one thing: coexistence with the unknown. There will be no more attempts to neutralize, to study, to interfere. The order is to maintain presence and observe. Observation has become worship. Outside, the people have their own rituals. They leave small offerings along the quays, coins, ribbons, bits of metal shaped like ships. Children whisper into the water before running away laughing. The elders do not laugh. They listen for an answer that sometimes comes, a faint echo rolling back across the canal, the same rhythm the divers once recorded in the wreck. Long, short, long. The signal endures. Economically, the Federation calls it recovery. Politically, it calls it renewal. But every policy built around the canal now bends around an invisible core, a silence that dictates the limits of action. Ministers speak carefully, avoiding the word accident. Admirals avoid the word ship. Even the term waterway feels too alive. In official language, the canal is now the continuum. Something that cannot be owned, only maintained. In private, the surviving engineers describe the phenomenon differently. They say the canal has become aware of its purpose, not as infrastructure, but as memory. Each wave that touches its banks repeats the pattern of the explosion in miniature, imprinting it upon the shoreline. Some claim that during electrical storms, the pulse can be heard miles inland, vibrating through the foundations of buildings. The sound isn't loud. It's intimate. It resonates inside the chest, in the exact place where breath becomes heartbeat. The rest of the world has moved on. Trade routes adapt, alliances shift, the headlines fade. But for those who remember that morning of the mist, the canal is no longer geography. It is prophecy, a reminder that no system built by human hands remains obedient forever. That what we construct to carry us forward may one day decide to move on without us. In the final internal memorandum, one unnamed observer wrote a line that has since circulated like contraband among analysts and sailors alike: "The canal is calm now, but it is not at rest." That sentence has become the quiet truth behind every public reassurance. Because calm, in this new era, no longer means safety. It means waiting. Tonight, as the fog drifts once more over the Baltic, the lights of the port shimmer across the still water, reflecting a city that believes it has survived. Somewhere beneath those reflections, in the black corridor where Severny, 401 sleeps, the signal continues, long, short, long, a message with no sender, no destination, repeating until memory itself dissolves into tide. The world above moves forward. The world below watches. And for those who listen carefully enough, between the waves, a voice seems to whisper back the only certainty left: the system remembers. Stay with us. What disappears from screens remains alive in the undercurrent, and the stories buried beneath official calm are the ones that define what comes next. Subscribe, because the tide will rise again, and when it does, you'll want to be among the first to hear what returns from below.